Confined Space Entry Program, Plaas Incorporated. Purpose. This confined space entry procedure is designed to ensure a safe working environment when work performed is in a confined space in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.146. We have determined that Plaas Incorporated employees may perform work tasks on construction sites that have confined spaces present. Written procedures are needed to ensure that the hazards of those confined spaces have been evaluated. This procedure is to be followed whenever employees of Plaas Incorporated are required to enter a confined space as defined within this procedure. Definitions. A confined space involves the following: adequate size and configuration for an employee to enter and to perform assigned work, limited means of entry or outlet, not designed for continuous employee occupancy. A permit-required confined space is a confined space that needs a permit to be entered. A permit is required if the confined space includes or potentially includes the following: atmospheric hazard, hazards related to the atmospheric conditions such as oxygen deficiency, flammable conditions, toxic conditions. Engulfment hazard, contains a material like bulk grains, soil, liquid, or dry cement which has potential for engulfing an entrant. Entrapment design, has an internal configuration such as an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a small cross section or makes escape or rescue difficult. Other recognized serious hazards such as inadequate ventilation, burns from high temperature, internal electrical or rotating equipment, lockout, tagout, emergency or hazards outside the confined space, physical injury from slips or falls or high noise levels inside the confined space, energy hazards from steam or electrical equipment inside the confined space. A non-permitted confined space for the purposes of this document is any confined space that is known not to have contained any hazardous material. In addition, all hazards are controlled and air monitoring indicates that the atmosphere is safe for entry. Entry into these areas for inspections or minor maintenance, i.e. adjustments, tightening of fittings, etc., may be made without the use of a retrieval system or standby personnel. Responsibilities. The program administrator. This person is responsible for developing detailed written instructions where required by this program and amending those instructions when necessary, reviewing the program and permits annually and making necessary decisions to ensure the success of the program. Authorized entrants. Those persons who have completed the training and are authorized to enter our permit spaces, authorized entrants, are assigned specific duties and responsibilities which they must perform when they work in the permit space. These duties and responsibilities, which are covered in the training program, include: know the hazards that they face during any entry, including mode, signs, symptoms of exposure, and understand the consequences of exposure to hazard. Understand the proper use of any needed equipment and complying with the provisions on the entry form and/or permit. Communicate with the attendant as necessary if the entry involves a hazardous atmospheric confined space entry. Alert attendant when a warning symptom or other hazardous condition exists or a prohibited condition is detected. Exit as quickly as possible whenever ordered or altered by an evacuation plan, evacuation alarm, warning sign, a symptom of exposure is detected or a prohibited condition. Keep lifelines orderly and untangled within the confined space. A confined space is entered when any part of the body crosses the plane of the space opening. Attendants. Attendants are individuals stationed outside a permit space who monitor authorized entrance. An attendant must be on duty outside of a confined space for the duration of the operation. Those persons who have completed the training and have been designated as permit space attendants are assigned specific duties and responsibilities which they must perform in permit space job duties. These duties and responsibilities which are covered in the training program include: attendants must know the hazards of a confined space, including information on the mode, signs, symptoms, and consequences of exposure. Keep lifelines orderly, untangled, and the ends secured outside of the confined space. Know the possible behavioral effects of exposure, which include the following: check permits of authorized entrance. Prevent entry by those without a permit and take the following actions when unauthorized persons approach or enter a permit space while entry is underway. Warn the unauthorized persons that they must stay away from the permit space. Advise the unauthorized persons that they must exit immediately if they haven't entered the permit space, and inform the authorized entrants and the entry supervisor if unauthorized persons have entered the permit space. Maintain a continuous count of those in the confined space. Monitor activity in the confined space and alert entrants to the need to evacuate. Summon rescue and emergency services when entrants may need assistance to escape a permit space hazard. Performs non-entry rescues. The attendant may only enter a confined space for rescue if they are trained and are part of a rescue team and are then relieved by another qualified and trained attendant. Perform no duties that may interfere with attendant's primary duty to monitor and protect authorized entrance. Remain outside the confined space until relieved by another attendant. Entry supervisors. Those persons who have completed the training and have been designated as permit space entry supervisors are assigned specific duties and responsibilities which they must perform in permit space job duties. These duties and responsibilities, which are covered in the training program, include: know the hazards that they must face during entry, including the mode, signs, symptoms of exposure. Also, they must understand the consequences of exposure to hazards. Verify all tests specified by the permit which have been conducted and all procedures and equipment are in place before endorsing the permit and allowing work to begin. Also, all procedures and equipment specified in the permit shall be in place before endorsing the permit and allowing entry to begin. The supervisor must sign the entry permit to authorize entry. Terminate the entry and cancel the permit when necessary. Verify rescue services are available and can be summoned if needed. Remove unauthorized individuals who enter or attempt to enter the space during entry operations. Determine that entry operations remain consistent with terms of the entry permit whenever responsibility is transferred, or at all intervals dictated by the hazards of operations performed within the space. Post-operations procedures. The entry supervisor shall terminate the entry and cancel the permit upon job completion or if conditions change within the confined space. The permit will be reviewed, verification will occur that the equipment is operational, and any employee concerns addressed. Procedural revisions may be required if the entry supervisor identifies that an unauthorized entry occurred, a hazard was identified that was not covered by the permit, the occurrence of an injury or near miss, or there are employee complaints. The manager of safety shall be informed if these reference items are identified. Hazard evaluation for confined spaces. Each job site that employees work on will differ. Therefore, to determine if there are permit-required confined spaces present at specific work sites where Plaas Incorporated employees are working, the site foreman will conduct a hazard evaluation of the workplace using the form entitled Confined Space Evaluation Worksheet, included in this program. This evaluation will provide on-site personnel with the information necessary to identify the existence and location of permit-required confined spaces that must be covered by the permit-required confined space entry program and the hazards associated with them. Each completed written hazard evaluation will be kept in the foreman's manual. Plaas Incorporated does not frequently enter confined space, and the confined spaces that may be present at a construction site are inherently different on a project-by-project basis. Therefore, it will be the policy of Plaas Incorporated to provide the following to its clients: a list of confined spaces to be entered on the particular project in question for review by the site foreman and the client's representative. This will provide both parties the opportunity to review the hazards and any specific equipment and personnel needs. The names of Plaas Incorporated employees working on the specific project who will serve as the entry supervisor, the authorized attendants, and the authorized entrants. The site foreman will act as the entry supervisor. The authorized attendants and authorized entrants will be the operators and laborers working on the site, who have been properly trained as entrants and/or attendants. The individuals involved in these roles will be identified and named on each entry permit. If more than one confined space is to be monitored by a single attendant, a second attendant must be provided or the practice will not be allowed. General requirements. The following requirements apply to entry into permit-required confined spaces. Any condition making it unsafe to remove a cover shall be eliminated before the cover is removed. Covers shall be removed and replaced using tools designed for that purpose. When entrance covers are removed, the entrance shall be properly guarded to prevent an accidental fall of an employee and to protect employee from foreign objects entering the space. Before any employee of Plaas Incorporated enters the space, the internal atmosphere shall be tested with a calibrated direct reading instrument for the following conditions in the following order: oxygen content between 19.5 and 23.5%, flammable gases and vapors not over 10% of the lower flammable limit, potential toxic air contaminants not over permissible exposure limit. All tests must be completed, accurate, and documented before entry. The space must be free of any hazardous atmosphere whenever an employee is inside. Smoking and open flame shall not be permitted within 20 feet of the confined space opening unless air samples indicate an atmosphere safe for hot works. No welding or burning will be permitted unless a special hot work permit is obtained. All ladders should be inspected prior to entry. Only approved low-voltage light and extension cords or electrical apparatus provided with a ground fault circuit interpreter shall be used in a confined space. When entering a permit-required confined space, there should always be an attendant present to ensure the authorized entrant is following procedures and to monitor his or her activity in the confined space. Continuous air ventilation shall be used as follows. An employee shall not enter the space until the ventilation has eliminated the hazard. The ventilation shall be directed as to ventilate the immediate area where an employee is working and shall continue until the employee leaves that area. The air supply for the forced air ventilation shall come from a clean source and may not increase the hazards in the space. If oxygen-consuming equipment is going to be used, or if an oxygen-consuming evolution will take place, continuous oxygen monitoring is required no matter what the classification of the space or the ventilation required. Permits. All entry to a permit space is restricted to those with permits. The use of a written permit will ensure that the current classification system reflects existing conditions in the space. The checklist of entry requirements are appropriate for that classification. Record-keeping requirements are met for each entry. Permits must be available to all employees requiring entry to a confined space that requires a permit space. This permit should extend only for the duration of the task. All permits must be retained in the safety file for a year to facilitate review of the confined space program. Permits must include the following: identification of the space, purpose of entry, date, time of issue and expiration, list of authorized entrants with method to determine which authorized entrants are inside the permit space, a sign-in sheet, names of current attendants and entry supervisor, list of hazards in the permit space, list of measures to isolate the permit space and eliminate or control hazards before entry, the acceptable entry conditions, results of initial and periodic tests initiated by the persons performing tests and the time tests were performed, rescue and emergency services including equipment and phone numbers, communication procedure for attendants and entrants to maintain contact during entry, required personnel protective equipment, respirators, communicators, devices, alarm, and rescue equipment, any other information which is necessary, any additional permits issued to authorized in the work permit space, such as for hot work under the fire safety program. Safe permit space entry procedures. When confined space entry becomes necessary, the person in charge of the work to be performed shall make the need for the entry known to their foreman. The site foreman will serve as the entry supervisor responsible for authorizing entry and issuing entry permits for work in confined spaces. The file of permits and related documents are kept in the foreman's manual. The site foreman is in charge of the entry and will be responsible for ensuring compliance with the entry requirements specified on the checklist and will ensure the permit is properly filled out. Upon completion of the entry, the site foreman will review and cancel the permit. A copy should be filed in the job holder and another copy should be sent to the safety manager. The permit must be posted outside the confined space while the authorized entrance is inside. The duration of the permit may not exceed the time required to complete the identified assigned task on the permit and will never exceed 12 hours. One permit is required for each specific confined space. If circumstances cause an interruption in the work or a change in the alarm condition for which the entry was approved, a new confined space entry permit must be completed. The permit expires when any of the following conditions are met. The entry operations covered by the permit have been completed. A change in work conditions introduces a new hazard. The time period of the permit has elapsed. When personnel, entrants, attendants, entry supervisor, who were not originally identified on the permit are assigned to the confined space work operation. Any other changes in the existing conditions occur that may cause a new hazard or cast doubt upon the ability to continue safely in the same fashion. Permits shall be readily available to all workers before entering a confined space, and the permit shall remain at the work site as long as the work is being performed there. The permit program and the completed permit checklist shall be reviewed at least annually. When atmospheric testing shows a dangerous air contamination, oxygen deficiency, or oxygen enrichment, the employer shall retain the written permit form or record showing the results of the atmospheric testing for a minimum of 1 year. Canceled entry permits must be kept for 1 year to facilitate the review of problems encountered and the appropriate changes made during the review. Providing unauthorized entry. To provide a safe work environment and to prevent exposed employees from accidentally entering a permit space, we have implemented procedures to inform all employees of the existence, location, and danger posed by permit spaces at Plaas Incorporated work sites. To inform employees of the existence of the permit space, we will use warning signs and/or verbal communication by the site foreman. If the space is found to be permit-required confined space, it shall be labeled by posting a sign reading, "Danger, permit-required confined space, do not enter." This sign will be permanently posted at the potential entry or access point to the space. If the space will not be entered, effective measures should be taken to see that entrances are adequately marked or blocked. To ensure that unauthorized employees do not enter and work in permit spaces, confined space entry is restricted to employees that have been specifically trained as authorized entrants. The site foreman will have the overall on-site safety responsibility. Pre-entry procedures. To ensure the safety and health of our employees before allowing authorized workers to enter a permit space, we will evaluate conditions in that space to determine if the conditions are safe for entry. The following steps must be taken before entry into a confined space is permitted. 1. Disconnection of lines. Lines that may convey flammable, explosive, toxic, or otherwise injurious or incapacitating substances into the space shall be disconnected, blinded, blocked out, or blocked off by other positive means to prevent the development of dangerous air, contamination, oxygen deficiency, or oxygen enrichment within the space. The disconnection or blind shall be so located or done in such a manner that inadvertent reconnection of the line or removal of the blind is effectively prevented. Number 2, calibration of testing and monitoring of equipment. Air testing and monitoring equipment shall be maintained and calibrated according to the manufacturer's instruction. This equipment shall be periodically calibrated with an appropriate test to assure proper operation. Records of calibration shall be maintained for a minimum of 1 year. Number 3, air monitoring. Prior to entry in a confined space, the space shall first be tested and ventilated. The atmosphere shall be tested using a 3-gas O2-LEL H2S or 4-gas O2-LEL CO2 H2S monitor supplied by Plaas Incorporated. Prior to testing, it must be ensured that the detector is fully charged, properly calibrated, and in operation for at least 10 minutes before the testing begins. For vertical entry confined spaces, the detector shall be lowered to the space to test each quarter section for 4 minutes in each position. The internal atmosphere shall be tested for the following conditions in the order given. 1. Oxygen content. 2. Flammable gas and vapors. 3. Potential toxic air contaminants. All areas of the confined space must be monitored to ensure the following conditions are met. Oxygen 19.5% to 23.5%. Combustibility under 10% LEL, CO2 under 35 ppm, H2S under 10 ppm, other toxins under or equal to PEL/TLV. If the monitoring alarms at any time during testing, immediately remove the monitor and note the readings indicated, oxygen, combustible, CO, H2S, to determine which readings caused the alarm. Ventilation is now required to bring the readings within the acceptable parameters. At this point, the confined space will remain as a permit-required confined space. If no alarms occur during the testing, proceed with purging. The space may be classified as a non-permit required confined space if all hazards have been controlled and ventilation maintains a safe air environment. Air monitoring is to continue during all entries. Record the findings on the entry permit. Do not enter the confined space at any time during the initial testing. Physical entry shall not be made into an unknown atmosphere. Employees or their representatives must be given an opportunity to request the space be reevaluated. Ventilation. Number 4. Where the existence of dangerous air contamination, oxygen deficiency, or oxygen enrichment is demonstrated by air testing, existing ventilation shall be augmented by appropriate means. Purging should be performed using an approved air blower supplied by Plaas Incorporated. The minimum purge time shall be 10 minutes. When the blower is set up, the intake must be kept away from any source of contamination, i.e. vehicle exhaust, traffic, etc. When the blower hose is lowered into the manhole, it must reach the lower 1/3 of the manhole and must be angled toward a wall to ensure complete ventilation. Once purging of the atmosphere has been completed, the atmosphere should be retested using the following procedures. 1. If no alarm occurs during the retesting, then entry may be made in accordance with the entry procedures discussed in the next section of this program. 2. If an alarm occurs during the retesting, check the following. A. Placement of blower intake. It may be necessary to hook a straight section of hose to intake in order to obtain an air supply away from any contaminants. B. Any vehicles or engines near the manhole that are running may be contaminating the manhole with exhaust. Shut the vehicles and or engines off or move them away from the manhole. C. If applicable, check placement of blower hose into the manhole to ensure it reaches the lower 1/3 and is directed toward a wall. D. If any of these factors or others are found to be potential sources of problems, then correct them and re-ventilate and recheck. E, if after reventilating the detector alarm does not alarm, then complete the confined space entry permit and proceed with entry operations. F, if after reventilating the detector still alarms, call for a second detector and notify your foreman. The second detector may be used to recheck the manhole. If the second detector does not alarm upon recheck, then inspect the first detector for low battery and possible malfunctions. If no malfunctions are found, then contact the site foreman, entry supervisor, before proceeding with the entry. If the second detector alarms during recheck, no entry should be made. Under no circumstances is entry to be made until the confined space has been established to be safe of atmospheric conditions. 5. Injurious or corrosive substances. Workers in confined spaces that have last contained injurious or corrosive substances to the eyes or body shall be provided with and shall be required to wear appropriate personal protective equipment. In addition, an eye wash and safety shower shall be provided within the work area outside of the confined space for immediate emergency use. 6. Plaas Incorporated Spaces. Where Plaas Incorporated spaces are blocked off as a unit, each space shall be tested and the results recorded in accordance with the air testing requirements of this program. 7. Ignition sources. No sources of ignition may be introduced into the space until implementation of appropriate provisions of this section has ensured that dangerous air contamination due to flammable or explosive substances does not exist. 8. Oxygen-consuming equipment. Whenever oxygen-consuming equipment is to be used, measures should be taken to ensure adequate combustion, air, and exhaust gas venting. 9. Oxygen enrichment condition. Whenever oxygen enrichment is possible due to conditions within the space, measures shall be taken to ensure that the oxygen level does not exceed 23% in the confined space. If tests indicate that the oxygen level is to be higher than 23%, hot work is prohibited until the ventilating techniques have reduced the oxygen level to less than 23%. Smoking. Number 10. Smoking shall not be allowed in confined spaces or within 20 feet of a confined space opening. 11. Automatic fire protection systems. Where there is no ready exit from spaces equipped with automatic fire suppression systems, employing harmful design concentrations or toxic oxygen displacing gases or total foam flooding, such as systems must be deactivated. External hazards. Entry supervisor must make sure that all external hazards are controlled. These hazards could be as such pedestrian vehicle, etc. In high traffic areas where an accident could occur by a motorized vehicle, concrete barriers must be in place to protect the confined space personnel. In high foot traffic areas, barricades such as rope or safety tape must be used to protect the confined space personnel from external hazards such as cutting, welding, smoking, or any other atmospheric altering changes that could result in suffocation. The entry attendant must also monitor and test external conditions to ensure that they are within acceptable limits within the permit space. Entry safeguard requirement. A confined space entry is defined as action which results in any part of the worker's body breaking the plane of any opening of the confined space. This section specifies the appropriate actions and equipment required to safely access the space in question. Once the confined space atmosphere has been tested, purged, and retested and determined to be safe, then entry may be made provided the following guidelines are followed. The person entering the confined space must carry the gas detector with them, and it must remain in operation at all times while the occupant remains in the confined space. If at any time the gas detector alarms, the confined space shall be evacuated immediately. If it is found that the detector is alarming due to a low battery, entry may be made using another detector provided the atmosphere is retested before re-entry. Ventilation, natural or mechanical as applicable, must continue while the authorized entrant is in the confined space. For entry into manholes, the ventilation supply hose may be temporarily removed from the opening to allow for entry, but the hose must be reinserted immediately after occupant has entered manhole. A standby person attendant must be stationed outside of the manhole or confined space and must remain in a visual or voice contact within the occupant at all times. Number 1, the standby person shall be specifically trained in confined space entry. Number 2, the standby person shall have the authority to order immediate evacuations of the space if there is any sign of intoxication from an undetected hazardous atmosphere or any other danger that warrants immediate evacuation. If injury occurs or occupant becomes unconscious while in the space, refer to the section titled Rescue and Retrieval. One attendant is required for each confined space that is entered. Multiple confined spaces entered during the same time will require a designated attendant for each confined space. Rescue and Retrieval. Plaas Incorporated personnel will not enter permit spaces to perform rescue operations. Plaas Incorporated personnel will use the retrieval systems to remove personnel in confined spaces. Local emergency services will be contacted immediately to assist in confined space emergency. Prior to confined space work operation commencing, the local responders will be informed of the site work tasks, confined space configuration, and the specific hazards. Local emergency rescue teams shall be trained to perform the assigned reserve rescue functions and have received the training required of authorized entrants. They shall also practice making permit space rescues at least once every 12 months by means of simulated rescue operations in which they remove dummies, mannequins, or personnel through representative openings and portals whose size, configuration, and accessibility closely approximate those of the permit spaces on site. At least one member of the rescue team shall maintain current certification in basic first aid and cardiopulmonary resuscitation (CPR) skills. To facilitate non-entry rescue, retrieval systems, body harnesses or wristlets or lifeline, shall be used whenever an authorized entrant enters a confined space. Retrieval systems shall meet the following requirements. Number 1, each entrant shall use a chest or full body harness with retrieval line attached at the center of the entrant's back near shoulder level or above the entrant's head. Wristlets may be used when the use of a body harness would create an additional hazard or interfere with the retrieval through a small manway entrance. Number 2, the other end of the retrieval line shall be attached to a mechanical device or fixed point outside the permit space in such a manner that rescue can begin as soon as the attendant becomes aware that rescue is necessary. A mechanical device shall be made available to retrieve personnel from vertical entry permit space more than 5 feet in depth. Number 3, rescue and retrieval must be on site when conditions are IDLH, immediate danger to life or health. Multiple employer entry procedures. All contractor or subcontractor personnel acting under the control of Plaas Incorporated must comply with all applicable provisions of these procedures or show proof that their procedures and employee training are at least as effective as these procedures. Contractors will be responsible for the permit space entry of their own personnel. They will be informed of the permit space hazards by giving them a copy of the form titled Contractor Hazard Information Identification for the permit spaces. Also, they will be informed of Plaas Incorporated safety procedures. They will not be permitted to enter spaces until a Plaas Incorporated site foreman acting as the entry supervisor has determined that they have a permit space entry program and that the contractor's program does not endanger Plaas Incorporated employees. When a contractor's personnel and Plaas Incorporated personnel perform permit space entry operations in the same permit space at the same time, both the contractor and Plaas Incorporated will provide an entry supervisor as a check and balance system. One or both parties may provide the attendants. The entry supervisors will coordinate the work so neither crew endangers the other. Entrants will be instructed to comply with each other's evacuation orders and evacuation alarms. Attendants will be instructed to immediately inform the other attendant if an evacuation order is issued or if an evacuation alarm is activated. This means the entrance of all employees will evacuate the permit space if any attendant, any entry supervisor, or any entrant issues an evacuation order. If there is a dispute over the necessity to evacuate, all entrants will evacuate and will remain outside of the permit space until the dispute is settled. When contractors perform work that involves permit space entry, then number 1, inform the contractor that the workplace contains permit spaces and that the permit space entry is allowed only through compliance with the permit space program, meeting the requirements of OSHA standard. Supply the contractor with the form titled Contractor Hazard Information Identification. Number 2, apprise the contractor of the hazards identified for the confined space. Number 3, apprise the contractor of any precautions or procedures that Plaas Incorporated has implemented for the protection of employees in or near the permit spaces where contractor personnel will be working. Number 4, coordinate entry operations with the contractors when both Plaas Incorporated personnel and contractor personnel will be working in or near permit spaces. Number 5, the Plaas Incorporated entry supervisor will debrief the contractor at the conclusion of the entry operations regarding the procedures followed and regarding any hazards confronted. Safety equipment and clothing. The entry permit will include a list of necessary protective clothing to be used in the confined space as determined by the qualified person. The employer will be responsible for the proper use of the safety equipment and the inspection and maintenance procedures performed on the safety equipment. The qualified person will determine the type of protective equipment required. Eye and face protection. Employees must use appropriate eye or face when exposed to hazards from flying particles, molten metal, liquid chemicals, acids, or caustic liquids, and potentially injurious radiation. Requirements for side protection, prescription lenses, filter lenses, and identification of the manufacturer of safety equipment must be specified. Protective eye and face devices purchased on or after July 5, 1994 must comply with ANSI 787.1-1981 or be equally effective. For persons who wear corrective spectacles, either prescription ground safety glasses or goggles will be provided at no expense. Additionally, if eye-irritating chemicals, vapors, or dust are present, safety goggles will be required. Here's an old confined space under head protection. 3.2. Head protection. Employees must wear protective helmets when working in areas where there is a potential for a head injury from falling objects and protection from any other hazard identified by the qualified person. Employees who are near exposed electrical conductors must wear protective helmets designed to reduce electrical shock hazards. Protective helmets purchased on or after July 5, 1994 must comply with ANSI Z89.1-1986 or be equally effective. Foot protection. Employees must wear protective footwear when working in areas where there is danger of foot injuries from falling or rolling objects, objects piercing the sole, or exposure of employees' feet to electrical hazards. Protective footwear purchased on or after July 5, 1994 must comply with ANSI Z41-1991 or be equally effective. Hand protection. Employees must use the appropriate hand protection whenever employees' hands are exposed to hazards from skin absorption of harmful substances, severe cuts or lacerations, severe abrasions, punctures, chemical burns, thermal burns, and harmful temperature extremes. Plaas Incorporated will select appropriate hand protection based on an evaluation of the performance of the hand protection relative to the task to be performed, the conditions present, the duration of use, and the actual and potential hazard is identified. Hearing protection. Employees will be required when engineering technology is insufficient to control the noise level and the ambient exposure limits exceeds those allowed in Table G-16 of 29 CFR 1910.95. Respiratory protection. The need for respiratory protection will be determined by a qualified person based upon conditions and test results of the confined space and the work activity to be performed. The respirators used will be NIOSH or MSHA approved devices and will be fitted and maintained in accordance with 29 CFR 1910-134. Body protection. All employees entering a confined space will wear full coverage work clothing as specified by the qualified person. Gloves and clothing made of impervious rubber or similar material are to be worn to protect against toxic or irritating materials. If the hazards of heat or cold stress exist in the confined space, clothing which has been tested to provide protection from overexposure to these hazards will be worn. Other body protection required in specific operations such as welding, flame resistance, riveting, heat resistant, and abrasive blasting, abrasion resistant, will be provided to ensure employees' safety. Training. Plaas Incorporated shall provide training to all employees involved in confined space entry so that they acquire the understanding, knowledge, and skills necessary to perform their job safely. The manager of safety may conduct or will contract out to qualified trainers to conduct our permit-required confined space training. All training-related materials, documents, and signed certificates are kept in the corporate office. Upon successful completion of Plaas Incorporated permit-required confined space entry training program, each participant receives a certificate which they sign verifying that they understand the material presented and that they will follow all company policies and procedures regarding permit space entry. The certification shall include employee's name, trainers, signature and initials, content of the training program, and the dates of the training. The training program consists of classroom, lecture, and group activities, hands-on, equipment monitors, PPE entries, and audio visuals. All new employees are trained to an awareness level as to the recognition of confined spaces. Only specific employees will be trained in confined spaces. This type of work is not performed daily by the Plaas Incorporated crews, and therefore limiting training to certain employees will help to maintain the competencies required to perform safely within confined spaces. Specified operators and laborers and foremen working on specific projects or utility construction will be trained in confined spaces. All employees must be trained to be able to recognize hazardous conditions, properly use monitoring equipment, space preparation, entry and work procedures, the permit system, and emergency response actions. Confined space entry training will include 1. The written program and its requirements, 2. The proper use of air monitoring equipment, 3. The proper use and limitations of body harnesses, lifelines, retrieval systems, and other personal protective equipment, 4. The proper use of all respiratory equipment, 5. The typical hazards that may be encountered and the consequences of exposure to hazards, 6. Recognizing the signs and symptoms of exposure to hazards, 7. Understand the duties specific to their role in confined space entry work as well as the duties of others who are involved as provided in this plan. 8. Evaluating and preparing a confined space for the entry. 9. The proper use of the permit system. 10. The importance and methods of maintaining communication between entrants and attendants. 11. Conditions that require evacuation of the confined space. 12. The importance and requirements for maintaining site control. 13. The requirements for concluding an entry and terminating the permit. 14. Proper confined space non-entry rescue procedures. 15. Welding, cutting, and brazing in a confined space. 16. Adult CPR and basic first aid training provided by the American Red Cross or American Heart Association. 17. The proper use and calibration of monitoring equipment. All employees will be trained on how to calibrate monitoring equipment. The program administrator shall certify that the training has been accomplished. Certification of the training will be made available to employees and their authorized representatives. Training intervals. Training shall be provided to each employee before the employee's first duty, before any changes in assigned duty, any changes in operations that present a hazard which an employee has not been trained, whenever Plaas Incorporated has reason to believe that there are deviations from entry procedures that could pose hazards to employees, at least annually. Lockout tagout. Safety equipment required during the procedure will be designed by the qualified person and is dependent upon the potential hazards involved. The confined space will be completely isolated from all other systems by physical disconnection, double block and bleed, or blanking off all lines. Blanks used to seal off lines will be capable of withstanding the maximum working pressure or load of the line with a minimum safety factor of 4. Be provided with a gasket on the pressure side to ensure a lead-proof seal and be made of chemically non-reactive material. Shut-off valves serving the confined space will be locked in the closed position and tagged for identification. In addition to blanking pumps and compressors serving these lines entering the confined space will be locked out to prevent accidental activation. If a drain line is located within the confined space, provision shall be made when necessary to tag it and leave it open. This will also be recorded on the entry permit. Additional procedures which are necessary when the confined space is of double wall construction, example water jacketed or similar type, will be determined by the qualified person and noted on the entry permit. Electrical isolation of the confined space to prevent accidental activation of moving parts that would be hazardous to the worker is achieved by locking circuit breakers and or disconnects in the open-off position with a key-type padlock. The only key is to remain with the person working inside the confined space. If more than one person is inside the confined space, each person will place his own lock on the circuit breaker. In addition to the lockout system, there must be an accompanying tag that identifies the operation and prohibits use. Disconnecting leakages or removing drive belts or chains that can achieve mechanical isolation of moving parts. Equipment with moving mechanical parts will also be blocked in such a manner that there can be no accidental rotation. Review. Plaas Incorporated will review entry operations when there is reason to believe that the measures taken under the permit space program may not protect employees. Circumstances requiring the review of the permit space program as follows. Any unauthorized entry of a permit space. The detection of a permit space hazard not covered by the permit. The detection of a condition prohibited by the permit. The occurrence of an injury or near miss during entry. A change in the use or configuration of a permit space. Employee complaints about effectiveness of the program. The program administrators will revise the program to correct deficiencies found to exist before subsequent entries are authorized. The written program should be reviewed annually by Midwest Safety Counselors Incorporated and will be revised as necessary to protect employees from confined space hazards. Confined Space Entry Learning Exercise by Plaas Incorporated. Number 1, name 5 types of confined spaces. Number 2, name 2 types of hazards that can be found in confined spaces. Number 3, name 2 roles that employees fill during confined space work. Number 4, having too little oxygen can result in asphyxiation. True or false? OSHA also feels that there can be too much oxygen in a confined space. Example, less than 19.5 and more than 23.5. 3.2. Having too little oxygen can result in asphyxiation. True or false? OSHA also feels that there can be too much oxygen in a confined space. That is between 19.5 and 23.5. No. That is 3.2. Having too little oxygen can result in asphyxiation. True or false? OSHA also feels that there can be too much oxygen in a confined space, less than 19.5 and more than 23.5. True. The increase in oxygen increases the risk of fire and explosion. 5. OSHA requires that 3 types of atmospheric tests be conducted in a confined space. These must be conducted in a specific order. Indicate below which tests should be performed first, second, and third. Flammable gases, vapors, and dust, oxygen content, toxic contaminants. Number 1, oxygen content. Number 2, flammable gases, vapors, and dust. And number 3, toxic contaminants. Number 6, true or false? Gases and vapors from different materials can have different weights. True. True or false? Normally an attendant is not allowed to enter a confined space to rescue entrants who may be in trouble. True. What documents the entry, okay? Number 8, what document the entry supervisor must sign before work can begin in a confined space? The entry permit.